certainly is going to be another year where having flexibility to be able to switch between liquid or dry is going to have some opportunities there. Because we've seen some weird things here. We had a couple years in a row, at least up in Northwest, where we could buy UAN cheaper than urea. That typically doesn't happen. But again, that having that flexibility, I think, has certainly made some guys some money. So anyway, so I'm going to start with Sandra wanted me for sure to hit, and she mentioned we've got revised nitrogen recommendations. And so corn and sorted nitrogen were the first ones to roll out revisions to, because those are the ones that needed the most work, and probably some of the bigger ones in terms of economic and environmental impact. We've now moved into, and we still have nitrogen work going on, but now we're picking up some of the phosphorus work, phosphorus in corn and sorghum, and then also wheat nitrogen work is going on. So our plan is to roll through all of those. They're going to revision that. Really what we're aiming towards is more of an online. It's a tough deal. We've got to do that static printed thing because that's what NRCS uses for like all their EQIP compliance, things like that. But in reality, we're hoping towards a more dynamic online, almost looking at kind of this ebook type format where we can update it more easily as we get more data in, rather than every 10 or 15 years doing big overhauls and everything. So, and we've got some other things in mind in terms of how do we make it more management and farm specific. So I'll get into that here in a minute. So here a couple of years ago, we basically started with a blank sheet of paper and said, okay, if we took everything we have on our corn and sorghum nitrogen recs and threw it out the window, what would we do if we started over? How would it look the same? Or would it look entirely different? And part of the reason we look at this is if you follow anything in the farm press, anything in the Corn Belt centric world, a lot of those states have went to what they call MRTN, maximum return to nitrogen. And they've got some state specific things. There's online calculators you can use, but there's a couple things in there you'll notice that are missing compared to what we're used to. One of the biggest ones being is there's no profile nitrate credit. There's nowhere to stick in. I took a soil test. Here's what I got. Well, in the winter time, what happens in a lot of those states to profile nitrate? What happens over that time period? They leach it out. They're kind of hitting the reset button. In Iowa, it's going down the drain tile into Des Moines drinking water. They're in a situation, they get enough more precipitation. They don't have that situation we do, like we was talking about, where we can have significant amounts of profile in our soils. So NDSU, they've done this MRTN approach, but they did have to put their own spin on it because they, very similar to us, east to west, huge precipitation gradient across North Dakota. So they do have somewhere in there you can bring profile in back in. Traditionally, what K-State has used has been a mechanistic type approach, and this is a similar approach in use by Colorado, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Cervatec, American Ag Labs. All of us are using some form of a mechanistic type approach. But we did take a look at, okay, does this fit for Kansas? And ultimately, we decided that it doesn't. I mean, when you look at the wide range of profile nitrate issues, when you look at the wide range, the other piece here is how much does their yield goal vary in some of these states? And here in Kansas, we can go from a 60 bushel dryland yield goal in Hamilton County to 300 bushel yield goal, under irrigation in Pratt or Barton County. And so that's pretty hard to take that level of variability into account. So let's talk a little bit about what I actually mean by mechanistic. And really that overall idea is to think about what are the peak uptake needs of that plant, okay, for a given yield goal, and then we work backward from there. So we're thinking about what do we need at the peak uptake, and then work backwards. So we got yield goal times some factor that gives us that peak uptake, and then we start subtracting off our credits. How much do we think will mineralize in organic matter? What's in the profile? what was our previous crop? And so there's this common misconception that it's a removal based system. Well, there's nothing in here that has anything to do with removal. It's about meeting the peak uptake needs of that crop. Okay. And this same structure, this is true for corn, wheat, sorghum, any of the crops that we're making a nitrogen recommendation for. The numbers change, but the concept is the same. So here's some of the data that's behind the scenes. And that's kind of another way of getting at, okay, well, how do we get to that uptake piece? So this is looking at uptake of nitrogen pounds per acre versus yield, okay? And so, and again, this has nothing to do with how much N is being removed in the grain. This is just looking at what are the needs, what's the peak uptake needed by that plant to produce a given yield. One of the biggest change coming in our new recommendations, we finally have enough data that we can split out irrigated and dry and treat those differently. Traditionally, we just said corn is corn, okay? But if you look at this and say, okay, for pick something here in the middle, for like 160, 180 bushel, we do have some areas in the state where we can raise, 160 dry land. But we're saying, okay, it takes, so the red line would be the dry land, okay, blue line's irrigated. If you look at that difference in there, again, we're saying it takes for a given level of yield goal, it takes more nitrogen dry land, okay? And that kind of is intuitive when you think about it, because if we're irrigating corn, what are we hopefully reducing or eliminating? Stress, right? Water stress, probably heat stress to some degree. And so by eliminating those other stressors on the plant, it makes sense that we'd expect that plant to be more efficient with a pound of nitrogen, right? Okay. And I think the data shows that for per pound of N, we can do more of that pound of N in an irrigated scenario where we're reducing those other stresses. So I know here, we're just talking dry land here, but do be aware that we're going to have two different options. The other piece of this, we've already hit on this a little bit, residual, and at 60, 70, 80, and it's pretty darn valuable to make sure we take advantage of that. We talked about, again, the wide range of yield potential. So again, for those reasons, we've decided that a mechanistic approach is really what we need to stick with. So Sandra showed a picture of our old publication. So maybe you've seen those charts in there. We got yield goal and organic matter, or I think how most people implement it is actually plug your own numbers in. That's pretty easy to do with a calculator or in Excel if you want. Let's just step through real quickly about how our old system worked, and that'll make it easier to understand how the new one works. So in our old corn system, we'd take yield goal times 1.6. That gave us that total uptake number. And then we'd subtract off our credits. Oops. And I'm going to take just a little bit of a sidetrack here. Got 1.6 pounds per bushel. And I get to hear this fairly often. UK state guys are nuts. It doesn't take 1.6. I can do it on 0.7 or 0.8 or whatever. And the farm press loves to talk about this number. A lot of farmers do too. And we're generally talking about bushels of corn or pounds of nitrogen applied per bushel of corn. Okay. It's a nice simple number for bragging rights. Probably not a bad approach in the Corn Belt, where again they're hitting the reset button every winter and they're not worried about profile nitrogen. Okay. But I would make the argument that if you don't know your profile nitrate at the beginning and the end of the season, this number doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot. Because if you go out and it's going to be easy this year to find fields that have 150 pounds of residual nitrate, 200 pounds of residual nitrate. I can go out and raise a heck of a crop without putting a single pound of nitrogen on. And I can make this number look really good, but it's not really a reflection of how much nitrogen it took to raise that crop. And so I think this number deserves a lot of caution. I think unless we know what we're starting and ending with, again, I'm not sure it's that useful to benchmark for us. But and again, that's people are, we're looking at pounds. Most of the time people are talking about this, it's pounds been applied per bushel raised. But what we're trying to get at is we're saying it takes 1.6 pounds of uptake per bushel of yield. We have a yield goal of 130 bushel, 130 times 1.6. Says, total uptake is going to be 208 pounds. Organic matter credit. So on our warm season stuff, we're saying about 20 pounds per percent of organic matter. That's that's a really rough number, right? Okay, we know there's a lot of, that's probably one of the noisiest pieces of this is that mineralization piece. But on average, a 2% organic matter soil, we think we're going to get about 2.5% organic matter soil will be about 50 pounds. It was 40 pounds, that's our profile. We measured profile in and got 40. So 208 total uptake, minus 40 in the profile, minus 50 from the organic matter, says that we need to apply about 118 pounds. If that all worked out, we raised the corn, that would come back to about 0.9 pounds per bushel raise. Okay. But again, I wouldn't put much stock in that number. Okay, so at the end of the day, as with any in recommendation method, it's still a best guess. There's a lot of noise in all of this, lots of moving pieces. So soil efficiency, we go back, what percent of that are we going to recover with crop? Fertilizer efficiency, of the fertilizer we apply, what percent of that are we actually going to recover and take up in the crop? And then organic matter mineralization, and Fred did an excellent job of talking about, we've got all the interactions with temperature, with soil moisture, all those things. If we have warm, damp springs, we can certainly drive mineralization pretty hard, and we're going to have well in excess of 20 pounds per percent of organic matter. If we start off dry and cool, or we have a really dry growing season, probably going to be less than that. So tremendous variability in that piece. Okay, so I mentioned we're going to split out irrigated and non-irrigated. We're also taking a fresh look at, that 1.6 pounds per bushel. And so this is kind of what we ended up with. The other piece that we'll talk about, we're wanting to go is, again, be able to make recommendations that are more specific to your farm and how you're managing nitrogen. Okay. So we'll walk through this. So the yield goal piece of this still is the same, expected yield. And then we pick a couple different efficiencies to put in here. So, and you don't have to work this by hand. We have this as a web tool. It's also pretty easy to set up in Excel. Here's our efficiency. So how many pounds per bushel? We're saying, and this again is uptake, 0.84 on the irrigated, 0.88 on the dry land. So, you get to pick what we're doing there. Yield goal, here's our soil efficiency. So what percent, if we've got a profile nitrate test, what percent of that value do we expect to recover? And at the moment, we only really have two options in here. We're hoping to, with time, our goal is to, flush this out and give more options that you can plug in. But in general, if we're on medium textured soils, or if we're in Western Kansas, we're saying we're going to recover 100% of that value, have the ability to access, 100% of that profile nitrate. Now, if I'm on some sand, or if I'm located in Eastern Kansas, where we got more leaching potential, we're going to knock that back to 70%. So that's all that we can recover. And we've had a lot of conversations on this year, and I guess, certainly on our deeper soils, they say, well, how can you think that you're going to recover 100% of that? I think part of our cover there is back to this conversation we was having on rooting depth. Part of that is, I think, if we're pulling a 24-inch sample, there's likely some nitrate underneath that 24 inches that the roots are going to get to, but we're not picking up. And that's where I think the buffer comes. That's what I consider as kind of our buffer there to protect us a bit. And if you're pulling a shallower sample, say the conditions only let you get a 15-inch sample or something, I think that's especially true, that there's quite likely some nitrogen underneath there that we're not picking up. We're not going to pick up in our tests. And so that's kind of where that buffer comes in. Yes, sir.
What is there a difference in efficiency if you're putting a pound of that in on, say, through the pivot, when that corn's at like B10 and B12, the roots are already there to be waiting for it?
Yep. So you're set up my next step for me. So actually, that's my fault. I jumped ahead. I'm talking about soil efficiency. We didn't talk about fertilizer efficiency. Marvin, I kind of skipped over that. So that's exactly what you're getting to. And so right now we've kind of got three different options in there. So back in that old 1.6 number, what was basically buried in there was kind of an implied assumption that our fertilizer recovery efficiency was about 50%. That was kind of the implied. What's that?
That most of it was going down.
Well, yeah, but just in general, we were around 50%. And so we know we've got a lot. I say a lot, and hopefully even probably the vast majority of our producers today are doing better than that. If we think about 50%, well, that's kind of a worst case scenario type deal. That's like fall applied broadcast urea. Nothing but bad things can happen to that, right? And so, and we fortunately we don't see that much of that anymore. But Martin, this goes back to exactly what you're getting at is again plugging in. Okay, where are we at? How are we managing that in? And so if we're doing broadcast fall applied, we're only sticking in an efficiency factor about 55. If we're doing something pre-plant, so like a February type application, we bump that to 65%. If we are culturing it on basically right at planting time and then coming back with side dress or fertigation, some type of split apply deal, then we bump that to 70%. This is kind of where we're starting ideally, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the studies we got going on across the state. Ideally, we want this table to be bigger, so we can say, okay, if you are spring streaming UAN, here's a good number. If you are culturing on UAN, here's a good number. If you're doing broadcast urea in February with NBPT on it, this is a number. And so basically that's kind of, I guess I'd say our vision for the future is to give even more options in here to let you pick, what best matches your management. Because this is I'll show an example in a minute. This is a huge deal. There's serious dollars on the table here in terms of picking up, especially at 80 cent in, basically being able to raise the same yield for 5% less nitrogen. That's significant money.
And then there's just only going to be more political pressure to be more efficient with nitrogen.
Yeah, you look at what's going on in the Corn Belt, or I don't know if any of you listen to KRVN. This whole issue is bubbling up in Nebraska again on nitrates drinking water. Yeah, there's a lot of issues, and so part of it is on the environmental side. I'll say that the flip side of that, I think we're going to see both stick and carrot. And actually, here in Kansas, I think we'll see carrot first because outside of Wichita's drinking water supply and some things further eastern Kansas, for the western part of the state, we fortunately don't deal with that many environmental issues. But some of these things that are going on with the end users of our grain, so I'll use as an example. We sat in some meetings this spring with a large grain company who has facilities in western Kansas, and this whole deal is coming down from starts at the bakers. And they're getting pressure to quantify what's the carbon intensity score of their business, especially if they're publicly traded and all this ESG stuff. They have to report it in their reports, with the SEC, what their carbon intensity score is. So the bakers are asking the millers, what's the carbon footprint of this flour? Well, the millers are asking the grain company, what's the carbon footprint of this wheat? And it's all coming back. And I think that's, for us here in Kansas, I think that's going to become the bigger driver is there's going to be market incentives. If your nitrogen going on your wheat's getting done at 70% efficiency versus 55, that's going to be worth some money to somebody. And I think that's how it's going to go. So it's interesting, our conversations, and I asked someone on their team, I said, so, okay, how far are we away from truck pulls on your scale load of wheat? How far away are we from differential pricing based on how that wheat was grown? And their response was they intend to have a system in place in 3 years.
Are they going to have a way to store it?
Well, but here's the thing about it is there's no reason to you don't have to physically segregate the grain. Wheat is wheat. It's all wheat. It's all a paper trade. It's all a paper trade. Because which in some hands is going to make it a lot easier to implement because there's no there's no reason to physically segregate it,
But
'cause it's
again,
all
that
wheat.
baker doesn't want a mixture, he wants.
Yeah, but the wheat's all the same. They can't tell the difference between this wheat and that wheat. It's just a matter of how many pounds of N did it take. You still got a bushel of 12 pro wheat. It just might have took different amounts of carbon to grow. So the best analogy I can give on this is we already see this happen in the ethanol business. So Campus Ethanol Plant, they mill both sorghum and corn. Sorghum-based ethanol and corn-based ethanol are valued differently in California because they have different carbon footprint scores. Well, it's the same ethanol coming out the spigot at the end of the plant. They can't tell whether it was corn-based or sorghum-based. And so every day they're keeping track of, okay, today we ground 60,000 bushels of corn and 40,000 bushels of sorghum. And so however many gallons comes out the spigot that day, 60% of those gallons are corn-based ethanol and 40% of those gallons are sorghum-based ethanol. And that's what they trade on the paper when they sell it into California. This will work, this is gonna be the same thing. So there's physically nothing different about the product. It's all a paper trade.
Well, we're giving them the information they think they need.
Yeah, they're gonna have to have the info to sell that. And so. Well, yeah, and so that's the question is how long, I think initially it is gonna be a premium. The question is gonna be at what point does it, switch to a discount? Yes, sir.
On that, they're telling in California now that they call it, you gotta have 24, whatever it is, your style. You know, before you can tell your product in California, that those people want to take the trail to the time it gets there.
Yeah. And so actually it's back to the soil carbon thing. I get asked about guys wanting to enroll in soil carbon stuff. And I said, it's some of this other stuff that we need to be paying more attention because I think there's actually probably more money to be paid on some of this other stuff than there is the soil carbon deal. And I think this is longer lasting because this is stuff we can actually measure. This is stuff that we can actually document. So much of this soil carbon stuff is assumptions,
That's a question I had for you. I can find prices to find this, but I don't have a research about fertilizer efficiency. Is there a place I can go to see what the ideas?
well, so this is gonna be in our revised recommendations. This will come out. Well, you got it. You got a copy right there. That's a good question. And we didn't, and Ann and I is one that we're struggling with where to put in there. By and large, if you're doing a good job of getting it sealed up, and especially like a spring applied deal, I'd be putting it here in the 65%. Yeah.
Because that makes a big difference besides the price. If I'm not
Right.
gonna use that either.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. And we struggle with High because we're not set up that way. We do want to include it in our plot work. It's hard to do. And I'm not even sure if the safety people are gonna let us continue doing it, but no, like a spring applied anti, if you for sure was getting it sealed up and everything good, I would probably put it in that 65 range. If we was doing something fall applied, I'd probably maybe be around that 60 with it. Be my gut reaction. I think we do. I need to ask over. I think we do have a little bit of anti-data. Probably team out. But no, that's the goal, is to give these numbers to you guys to use, because this is painful work. You're not going to do this on your own on a farm.
I know the price.
Yeah, well, I mean, just the labor involved in getting every one of those dots, and a lot of them are doubled up. Every one of those dots involves somebody cutting by hand some length of corn and running it through a chipper shred. And it's tedious, tedious stuff. I don't know if we'll get to county level, but certainly like on the mineralization piece, I could see a day where we talk about, can we tie it in with the Mesonet data and come up with kind of more regional estimates, maybe like by crop reporting districts. So like North Central, Northwest, Central, I don't know that we'll ever get to county level, but I do think we can, the hope is to at least dial this in a little more on a regional level. So, good questions. Okay, so we're kind of stepping through this. We talked about there's our internal efficiency, fertilizer efficiency, how much of the profile are we going to recover? But those are kind of the pieces to it there. Sorghum, we don't have enough data to split out irrigated and dryland sorghum. We're treating it all the same. But then all of this is the same as for corn in terms of recovery efficiency and soil efficiency. How does it compare? So here's a dryland corn example. If you look at across the bottom here is yield goal. Vertical is pounds and then recommended. The old K-State rec, and I don't think it was any secret, especially, and we don't see it quite as bad on the dryland here. We tended to over recommend, especially in a high yield situation. So that's the old K-State rec in the blue circles. The new K-State rec is in the orange squares. Servitech would be the dashed blue line. American Ag Labs in the green triangles. UNL's in these boxes here. So it certainly has changed kind of where we're at things and brought us more in line with some of the others out there. Irrigated is probably where some of the biggest differences are, which that's not that important to anybody in here, but our old recommendation, we were definitely over recommending a high yield soil, so I don't think that was any secret. Okay, and Fred, I think showed something fairly similar to this, thinking about agronomic optimum and economic optimum. This is kind of a pooling of all that data, looking at it a different way. And here's the thing, we talk about the mineralization piece and how variable it is. Well, both mineralization and profile in. Here's all the zero plots. We had 0 pounds of N applied. And we've got yields ranging from 10 bushel to 190 bushel with 0 pounds applied. And if you've looked at very much in response data, that's not surprising, right? I mean, depending upon how much residual we had, how much mineralization we got, not inconceivable to think that we can raise 190 bushel corn with nothing applied. Now, you're not going to do that every year. There's a reason we don't recommend 0. But in general, that's kind of the overall response we get. And so thinking about the economics piece of this, you know, average across all sites across the state, our agronomic optimum in general is about 234. If we put today's prices into that, so well, what's agronomic optimum say? What's our assumptions there? What would have to be true in order to make you to want to put on 234 pounds of N? What rain, but we're assuming what? The agronomic optimum, we're having to assume that what is free. We're having to assume what is free. Nitrogen, right? It'd have to be free nitrogen and free application in order to justify that, right? Okay. But nitrogen's not free, application's not free. And so if we stick in our long-term averages, if you figure 350 corn and 33 cent in, it backs you off about 10% off that. Because it comes down to diminishing returns, right? How much extra yield am I getting out of each additional pound of nitrogen? Eventually that deal flattens out. You're not getting that response. Now, how sensitive we are to that, how far we back that down has to do with this price ratio. What's corn worth versus what's the cost of the N I'm putting on, right? If corn's really valuable and nitrogen's really cheap, well, that's going to move me further up this line. Corn's really cheap and nitrogen's really high, it's going to back me down off this line, right? Because what's the relative value that I'm getting out of that additional pound of N? Okay, so in general, long-term average, we'd be running about 10% off the agronomic optimum. Now, if we stick something more similar to today's numbers in, how much do you think that backs you down a little bit more? Gonna back us down a little bit more, right? How much do you think we take off that? Another 3%, 20%? I stick in $5 corn and buck in, which actually wouldn't be very far off where we're at. Take the N back down to 70, 80 cents, and we get new crop booked at 6 something. The ratio is about the same. Basically, it takes about another 10% off. Okay, and so last couple of years, it's been interesting, number of calls I've been getting from folks saying, well, how much should we just back off our rates? And you visit some folks say, oh, I think we're just gonna cut 30% across the board. Well, that might be drastic. Now, the part of this that's interesting is what I've observed the last couple of years is this whole question, it's as much about psychology as it is agronomics and economics. What type of manager have you been in the past? Are you someone who's made sure that crop has never been short a pound of N ever on your farm? We tend to maybe over apply a little bit. Or are you someone who gets a thrill out of riding the razor's edge and we're hoping to just start getting a little bit of lower yellow leaves as that crop is finished? That puts you in two really different spots in terms of how you can back off, because we've got some folks that can back off 15-20%, and in most years it's not going to hurt. But we also got some guys who are pretty tight managers on their end historically, and they probably don't have 10% of room to work with. And so there's a little bit of self-reflection of, okay, how have I managed my end historically? Gives a little bit of insight into how much of a big adjustment can I make. But again, at the end of the day, even last year we was looking at this, even at 80 cent in, there is no crop input that will give you a higher return on investment than nitrogen. Even at what we perceive to be high prices.
Is there a reason though that we don't want to be back there if the economic optimum?
No, I'm saying this is where we want to be. Yeah. Sorry, I'm saying this is, and so it goes. So my point is okay. If you make the assumption that we've been good managers historically and we've been operating near this economic optimum, that if you throw prices out of whack, it basically would back us off about 10% from that long-term average. But my assumption is that over the long haul, our good operators have been working around this point. And so if we get a sudden run up in nitrogen prices, maybe it backs us off 10%. So my point is, those guys that are saying, well, how much can I afford to back off? If I had to just give a back of the envelope gut feeling answer, this is where I kind of come up with 10%.
I just know there was a time I don't think we focused nearly enough on ROI.
Yeah. Well, because that's kind of some long-term averages, but you can also go back to when N was 20 cents a pound, right? And maybe corn was 4.50, and you were pretty darn close to the top anyways. Yeah, and in an irrigate scenario, we had cheap fuel. So
I was reading an article in the paper for some places that they want a forecast of rain for a couple of days before.
Well, yeah, so we'll come back to that. There's some good reasons to think about that, right? Sandra mentioned yield goal. Okay, and so we think about, where does money be made in nitrogen management? One of those is picking a proper yield goal. And so back to your point, part of that's maybe rainfall today, but for, we think about a dry land deal. If I've got a full profile versus completely dry profile, that probably should lead me to picking a different yield goal, right? Depending upon how I'm starting the year. And so, so I think that's part of that. And then the other piece of that is thinking about nitrogen losses. We'll revisit that. So where's our economic choices? We've talked about the yield goal thing, knowing what we have. Profile nitrate, really important. If we screwed up on step one last year, maybe we fertilized for 100 bushel sorghum crop and we raised 30. But the other piece of this, it's become really interesting and had a lot of conversations on this with folks last week. How far that crop got before it died makes a big difference in terms of how much where that residual N is. The guys that are actually probably in, from a residual nitrate standpoint, the stuff that only made it 6-8 inches and died, most of that's still in the soil. But we also got a lot of crop out there that made it to, tassel or boot and died. We've got a lot of that nitrogen tied up in the residue out there yet. It's not going to cycle back this year. It's going to be more of a delayed release, for the next what, 2-3 years going out into time. Yeah,
We had a number of fields, and even Milo didn't had, or spots of fields in, and they just failed it all. Are we really kind of back to square one, just go with your soil tests?
yeah, that's an excellent point. So if we went out and bailed off that failed crop, there went the nitrogen with it. So then we are basically back to a soil test deal. We're not expecting any to come back available out of that residue because it's gone. We hold it off. No, that's an excellent point. So so if you did take stuff, if you bailed stuff off, then we really are back to, what's in the profile.
How much gets returned with some of these soybeans that shattered or wind up on the ground, after they bailed? There's nutrient value there to some degree, and there.
Yeah, there is. I think, but when I think about soybeans, I think about something that's fairly slow to degrade. I think that's gonna be a fairly, because think about how many months after harvest you still find, beans out there that are hard as a rock and it's still, it hasn't changed much.
And how much maybe the wildlife have.
Yeah.
Lucas, when you talk to the grain company you talked about in going to this carbon score and paying space on that, what was their response to the conversation we just had about drought? Because this past year, as you mentioned, our NUEs were terrible just because we didn't raise the crop. I don't minimize for that on something we can't control. Did they have any thoughts on that, or is that just it is what it is?
No, I mean, and frankly, that's not even on their radar. I mean, that's why it's really important we stay engaged with these people and because there's a lot of things like that, because the current, not to get too far off on a tangent, but part of the reason we got involved in this now is this whole issue of nitrous oxide emissions out of sorghum production. And so the last time California Air Resources Board, last time they worked the numbers on this, well, no one has ever measured this in dryland sorghum production. So being as that number didn't exist, they went and pulled the number out of central Illinois Corn Belt. Well, if you take a nitrous oxide loss number out of Illinois and bring it out here and apply that to a dryland sorghum yield, your emissions per bushel of grain or per gallon of ethanol look really, really bad. And so and these people don't, and a lot of brilliant people, but they couldn't tell you the difference between a corn plant and a sorghum plant, if you held it up. And so that's, I guess I view we've got some pushback as, well, why are you guys involved in any of this stuff, blah, blah. And it's like, well, somebody has to, try and help educate these folks that grain production in Colby is not the same as grain production in Monmouth, Illinois. There's different environmental factors. And so so you bring up a really good point, how are they going to handle that? Because, and making sure we can document, okay, well, there's this much nitrate left in the ground, or this is the nitrate still tied up in residue, work with them, say, these are the things you're going to have to consider, as part of that. No, that's a good question. Sandra, how much time do I have left? I know we're way long. Okay. So we talked about yield goal, profile in, and then some of this improving fertilizer efficiency, some things we've already hit on in terms of application methods. You guys are probably familiar with this: right source, right rate, right time, right place. And again, this is going to come back to some of these things on where I think the industry is going in terms of carbon intensity scores, is doing these things right. Let's look just briefly at the economic value of knowing soil nitrate. Skip the irrigated examples. Here's dry land. Say I've got 135 bushel yield goal at 5 1/4 corn, 97 cent in. That's a little bit high for where we're at today. What's the difference in my recommendation if I have 80 pounds in the profile versus 15 in order to get to the same yield goal? If I've got 80 pounds out there and I test for it and I find that, well, now my nitrogen recommendation is actually around 10 pounds or 970 an acre. If I take into account or if I don't have it said 80 pounds residual, I got 15 pounds. Now I'm needing to apply about 95 pounds to hit that 135 yield goal. It's going to cost me 92. For taking into account that 65 pounds of in. I'm buying 37 cents. Why is a pound of nitrate more valuable in the ground than the pound I'm buying across the scales? What can happen to nitrogen after we apply? Volatilization, leaching, denitrification, right? Lots of bad things. You think about this nitrate that's in the ground, I've already paid the loss tax on it, right? Whatever bad things were going to happen to that applied nitrogen has already happened. It's in the ground. It's fairly, other than from a leaching standpoint, it's fairly stable, right? And so it's got a higher economic value on it because I've already paid that loss. I've already had to eat that cost. And so again, from an economic standpoint, better to use, you know, you've already paid for this stuff. Okay, better to use that first before you know, for 65 pounds at $1.50 a pound, that'll pay for a lot of soil sampling to make sure that that's there. Take advantage of it. Let's get into some of the difference in placement, being money on the table from improved management. This is an irrigated example. 35. These are using our long prices, 380 corn, 35 cent in. This is just looking at the difference between broadcast fall applied. So, and this is worst case scenario, right? This is broadcast fall applied, so like 55% fertilizer recovery efficiency versus inject and split applied. So that more that 70% recovery efficiency. In order to hit that same yield goal, we're talking about a difference in what 55 pounds. Difference 55 pounds in order to hit the same yield goal, just because of the difference in efficiency. This broadcast fall applied, we're going to lose more of this in. So that's that difference there. Well, that's $19 an acre on lower average prices. If we stick something more extreme in there, 5 1/4 corn, 97 cents, same deal, all the prices. Now we're talking about a difference of $53 an acre. If doing this, if moving from broadcast fall applied to injected and split applied UAN, okay, maybe you got to buy a coulter rig or a injection pump with pivot or whatever, you can justify a lot of capital investment for $53 an acre. You actually, on long-term prices, you can justify a fair bit of stuff on $19 an acre. Because this is year over year, every year. So anyways, I think there's some opportunities there that we can do some economics and see where can I improve. We've got a long ways to go. We talked about this a lot. Let me skip ahead and get some of the few things I wanted to talk about. Phosphorus. So this is some new work Dorovar's group's doing. The wheat piece, the kind of finished up the wheat phosphorus piece of that. I'll show you some of those results. We are going to be making some changes, I think, in terms of our phosphorus recommendations. That's further down the road, but we have uncovered some interesting things in this more recent work. This is on the corn side. At 13 sites in 21, 20 sites in 22. You know, in general, these are on low soil testing sites. Okay, this would be average across irrigated and dryland. In most of these cases, 30. You know, and again, this would be like 10 part per million, pretty low sites. We'd expect to see a response to in most of these cases, 30 pounds of P is enough to maximize that response if we're in a low soil test scenario. Maybe you could make the argument, not statistically, but numerically, maybe it's somewhere between 30 and 60 if we look at the lowest of those soil testing sites. But in general, that kind of falls in line pretty well with where we're at on the corn side. mention the different soil test methods that are out there. Most labs have switched to Malic 3. It's cheaper to run, more stable at higher soil pHs is a big thing to pay attention to, versus the Bray one, which we knew had issues, certainly above pHs of 7.2, 7.3, the Bray would start to essentially underestimate how much phosphorus was available. And of course, we recommend on the higher pH situations, at some point, we're just better off to run the Olsen. Fred, where do you guys switch over? Where do you run?
Well, that's hard to, really don't have a cut, it tends to be customer preference. Yeah, well, sometimes we double check.
So I think, somewhere here, 7.3, 7.4 maybe is where we need to look at shifting. I know there's some other labs out there, they change on the fly, they run the pH first, and then that can be problematic if you're grid sampling and half the field gets run as Malic and half of it gets ran as Olsen. But anyways, but again, on the high pH, high calcium carbonate stuff, the Olsen does do a better job. Even the Malic starts to underperform in some situations. So just be aware of what's being done to your soil. This has been interesting. And again, we're actually got some nicer data sets to come out with some tissue concentrations for more in-season diagnostic type work. That's something that people have asked a lot for over the years, but we didn't have a real great Kansas data set to work with. And so again, this whole plant P at V6 and then earleaf P at R1 maybe starting to see some useful critical values in there. Economics of phos in the year of application on corn. And so this is across 12 locations in 21. This figured in 5 1/4 corn, 86-cent phos. Again, look, so this is net return to P in terms of dollars per acre. We cross over that zero line at about 20 part per million, which is, again, that's our threshold value. Above 20 part per million, we'd say it's highly unlikely that you're going to see a response to applying additional phos. And that's, again, 12, it's just 12 site years all in 21. But again, that's kind of validating that 20 part per million there. But not surprisingly, these lower soil test P values, and we're down here in this 10 part per million, even at 86-cent phos, we're still talking about net returns in $50 per acre type range to make that application. But again, once we go over 20, we tend to go negative on net returns. So just kind of validating some of our existing recs there. Talk about wheat. 24 locations across a couple years. Did a pretty decent job of getting those scattered across the state. And of course, the classic photos, even in areas of decent soil test phos, we tend to see a nice visual effect from putting some P on in furrow. Often doesn't always translate into yield, but we can almost always get that visual response. But these are all fairly low soil testing sites, and so we saw some pretty significant responses. Here's a set of treatments that were put out. So full control, 0P, 0N, and then everything else had 100 pounds of N at different rates of P. That N went on as 50 pounds at pre-plant, 50 pounds at spring green up. This phos this is broadcast applied. And so that's one of the caveats I want to put on here is, the responses we're seeing out of this is broadcast applied. If we're placing that in furrow with the seed, with our drill or air cart, we're probably going to be able to get the same responses on lower rates of P, right? Because we get that banding effect of having that nearby the seed. Okay, so this is average across locations. I apologize. I got to change this slide. This is still in the metric. So overall biomass, we look down here at yield, 3,000 kgs. This is about 50 bushel wheat here, is what we are averaging on the 0 pounds of phos. And then again, a pretty nice response on up to what would be 80 pounds. This would be 0, 40, 80, 120 pounds of P applied. And so really, even in these real low soil test situations, if we're broadcasting P, 80 pounds is enough to maximize that response. But again, if we're going in furrow, I think we can probably get by with significantly less than that in order to maximize the response within that year. This is kind of the more, and this, can't see it well on the screen, but this one thing that will be coming out from revise our cost recommendations is, we're seeing some pretty significant differences in what that threshold value is for wheat in terms of managing soil test feed. And I think we've always known intuitively that wheat does have, is more responsive to phosphorus, probably does have a higher threshold value. But this is probably one of our better attempts at actually dialing that in. And this actually really turns into more of an economics question. The threshold p-value for corn looks to probably be closer to that 18 part per million on a Mehlich 3. And on wheat here, we're coming up closer to about a 27 ppm threshold. And so it actually becomes more of an economics question. Do you have wheat in your rotation? If you don't, if you're just growing continuous corn, you probably can't justify economically being at 27 part per million. But if you have any significant amount of wheat in your rotation, this data would suggest maybe we need to be rethinking what that threshold is. So anyways, on the Mehlich, to get at that, well, the 90% yield level is about 23, but to get that 95% yield level, that breakover is about 27 part per million. This, Fred, this is the one that's really interesting to me. Traditionally we've thought of Bray and Mehlich as being fairly interchangeable. When we fit the data to it, though, our Mehlich threshold is around that 21 part per million. The Mehlich 3 is giving us a higher threshold value. Olson tends to run lower, on the scale anyways, but anyways, the idea is we'll have threshold values for a variety of the tests that are out there. H3A, that's the Haney. It's coming out at about 20 part per million as well. So, but I think that's something we're going to have a lot of discussions about is what these threshold, are we ready to go to crop specific threshold values? The economist in me would say, yeah, we need to do that. That's the stuff that's above 0.4 house rates. Here's the Olson. Does a pretty decent job of the Olson versus the Mehlich. We can see a little bit underestimated on the Mehlich. I want to point out on the and again this back. Fred mentioned some of these other tests that are out there. The Haney has got some traction. Be aware it's got some of the similar issues as the Mehlich and really especially the Bray. Under high pH conditions, the Haney tends to underestimate available phos, and that's really no surprise. If you've read up much about it, it's a weaker extractant. It's supposed to be more of a water soluble, more representative type deal. But again, we see it underestimating P in those high pH type situations. So just be aware of that. Yeah, here's just another way of looking at both soil pH and carbonates. This is just looking at the ratio of Mehlich 3 to Bray 1. It really starts to fall apart, at these higher pHs, or when we get above about 8% soil carbonates. Same thing on the Haag. CEC. Traditionally, labs have been doing an ammonium acetate extraction for CEC. Most labs are moving towards Mehlich 3. Fred, have you moved to Mehlich 3 for cation exchange? Yeah, for quite a while, right? I mean, back to the same thing. It's a cost thing. You already are running this. Can we do more with it? It's also, there's some environmental disposal issues here. But again, this is the direction a lot of labs have been going. The thing to be aware of, if you've got a long soil test history, and when your lab has made that change from ammonium acetate to Mehlich 3, you're going to see a jump in some of these numbers. Most pronounced is going to be for calcium. The others for K, magnesium, sodium, it tends to be fairly stable across pHs. But when we look at the calcium piece of it and the overall calculation of CEC, you can see here once we get up into these 7 and 8s on pHs, that's where things can really get skewed while making that conversion from maybe what you've historically seen on your test to what you're getting back to. Section up in Jewell County, Jewell Smith County line area. Some work Dormore's been doing. Fred mentioned the whole stratification issue with pH. So this is stuff that had gotten low enough that even in a 6-inch sample was coming back with a line recommendation from the lab. And Fred mentioned drought, skewing pH lower. Just be aware of that, you may have samples come back this year that all of a sudden have lime recommendations. And it's probably worth some additional sampling. Don't call the lime truck yet. It's probably worth some additional investigation to make sure that that's real, not just an artifact of the drought. This, however, was real. It was low enough that in a 6-inch sample, multiple years was calling for a lime rec. So Dorovar and his crew put some plots out. This is all surface applied. 2 different fields up there, again, kind of on in between Jewel and Smith counties. Looking at, so this is change in pH after application with depth, and put on half ton, and 3 tons VCC. And so in general, at that 3 ton rate, we're moving stuff, somewhere around 1.5 to 1.75, or a unit, half a unit, 3/4. At the 1 ton rate, about 3/4 of a unit of pH, and a half ton rate is moving us just a little over or under a half a unit of pH. So we were able to get that neutralized in the top. If you look at how deep that's going, really it's in that top 3 inches is where most of that change is occurring. At this site, maybe we went just a little bit deeper on that with that highest rate. So this is interesting, and this is where, this is the next step is, okay, because the question we've had is, okay, if we think about lower soil pH, is that all bad? What does lower soil pH help us with? Availability of what? Phosphorus. And typically some of our other micros that are a challenge, right? Iron, zinc, all those become more available with lower pH. But if we think about some other things in our cropping systems, what can lower pH be actually be negative to the soil other than crop production? What about herbicides? What happens to the residual length of a lot of our herbicides with lower pHs? Tend to be shorter lived, right? Okay. And so we got kind of a 2-edged sword. We've had this question is, okay, well, we're seeing these stratified pHs. Do we need to do something about it? So this is really interesting, tracking the yields. And this ground's in a wheat, corn, soybean rotation. So if you look here at wheat, fairly unresponsive, maybe, statistically no difference there to putting on any lime. Corn, get a nice yield bump there from that first half ton, really nothing beyond a half ton. And then I think this is really interesting on the beans, a real nice increase there going from a half ton to a full ton. And so, we've had some conversations on what's really driving this. Well, low pH can inhibit what in soybeans? Inoculation, right? Okay. And so how much of that's a driver there? What's really interesting is, and the slide's not in this deck, Dorovar sent me the slide. What we are seeing in these low pHs, exchangeable aluminum does go high. And I didn't know, with our mineralogy of these soils here, if we'd see that or not. That's a big issue in South Central Kansas, aluminum toxicity. Basically burn off the tips of your wheat roots. And so it's interesting to me, we see that aluminum toxicity, we see exchangeable aluminum come up in the soil test, but we really don't pick up that big of a yield response in the wheat. Now this is darn good wheat, 80 bushel wheat on average. This is the average of the 2 sites. So I found that interesting, that actually our biggest yield response is coming in the beans, with a pretty nice one in the corn as well. So I think something to keep an eye on. And then the one last thing I was going to hit, this is a follow-up to Sanders' deal on sampling. Brian Rutter's a grad student down in Manhattan, working with Dorovar and yes, looking at this whole issue of how good of a job do we do taking care of our samples after we pull them. And specifically as it relates to nitrate. And so what he did is took 100 pounds of bulk soil from an area in a field, mixed it up, thoroughly mixed it, sieved it, and then put that into bags, and then fully randomize those bags. He had some of those that then were a control. He had a bunch that went into cold storage, stuck them in a fridge, and then pulled them out at 2, 4, 8 to 14 days. And then he took that same number of bags and stuck it into like one of those black plastic packer type toolboxes, in a pickup. And left them in there and pulled them out, ran them through the lab at 2, 4, 6 on up to 14 days, okay? So this is in the summer, this is done in Manhattan, a little higher, I'm surprised they have that high of a pH on some stuff in Manhattan, there's organic matter. This is important when we come back to this topic of mineralization, just 3% organic matter, silt loam soil. This is temperature, air temperature, and then air temperature within that black toolbox. So this is in summertime. He started this on June the 9th. You can see here that, within that toolbox, average somewhere around about 90-degree temperature. The highs of that, that a couple days there, it hit 125 degrees inside there. Okay, and which was a full 25 degrees, 25 to 30 degrees above ambient air temp. So think about what's happening there, and Fred mentioned the whole, drivers of mineralization. So we ran those for all these things. These are the things that did not change by storage method, whether you put them in the fridge or left them in the truck. These are the things that changed just as a function of time. And this was time by storage, and this really is the big picture. The big issue here is the nitrate. On the micronutrients, there was some statistical significance showed up, but from an agronomic standpoint, it really wouldn't have changed the recommendation very much. So take that as well. Here's the big thing: nitrogen and sulfur. This is the plot that matters. Here's days after sampling. So here is ammonium in. The nitrate in, of course, that was fairly stable through time. The black dots are the stuff that was stored in the truck box. Gray dots is stuff that went into the fridge. You got parts per million here on the left, but what's really important is how that would have affected it by the time we converted it into pounds per acre. And so you've got the stuff that went into the fridge here that didn't change. That value was coming back at around 30 pounds per acre. The stuff that sat in the truck beds for 12 days would have came back with lab value just shy of 120 pounds per acre. Got a moist enough soil, lots of heat, just sticking that mineralization process into overdrive. And so you're getting a lab value back, say you got close to 120, you really got 30. If you base your nitrogen recommendation on this, you're going to end up with some yellow wheat, right? Because we're assuming that there's 90 pounds of in there that doesn't really exist. So again, that sampling deal, if you can't get stuff to the lab right away, open those bags, let them air dry, or ideally get them into a fridge if you can, if it's going to be an extended period of time. But don't leave them in closed sealed bags, somewhere that's going to get heat to them. That's just gonna drive that mineralization thing.
And what if they just have it in a bucket? Plastic.
Yeah, I mean, air dry, I think is the most important thing. Don't seal that up and then expose it to heat. I guess here's the thing to think about is if that soil's wet enough that we all kind of got a feel for, if you seal that up and set it somewhere it's going to get warm, how much condensation you have in the bag. That's a pretty good indicator of what your risk is of driving mineralization, I think. I don't know, Fred, any thoughts or comments?
I reckon just skip.
Yeah.
Put them in there. We bring it in and we actually try it.
Yeah, I think that's the best thing to do is get it to the lab right away. If you can't do that, if you're strung out over a period of time and you're wanting to collect them, take them at once, at least let them open them up and let them air dry, stick them somewhere cool, or stick them in the fridge.
It shows the plastic bag, the means of air drying or not.
I'm sorry, was
The plastic bag, like I know.
yeah, I think the main thing is so that it's open at the top.
Some of those look a little glossy. I know some texts are just brown paper. They look like they breathe a little bit. And at one time, you guys were using cloth bags. But
Yeah, and cloth bags work really well. I mean, because then they're drying the whole time. But yeah, a lot of these have that wax coating,
yeah,
to them that really, once you roll the top, they're not quite like a zip lock, but they're dang close.
so you probably leave those open if you
Yeah.
weren't gonna ship them for there.
Yeah. or stick them in the fridge. I mean, samples are amazingly stable in a fridge. I mean, if we've got stuff that we know we can't get to for whatever reason, some stuff that we're not gonna get to for months, stick them in deep freeze. They stay pretty stable. Anyways, that was the last thing I wanted to share. Yeah, we won't dive into that. So questions, comments, we covered various pieces of ground, so.
I want to ask them, dang,
Martin first and then I'll catch you.
How wet do you want soil to put in on hydrogen?
Well, ideally, we'd have some moisture there, right? So that we can get, so we can, well, there's a couple pieces of that. A is give the anhydrous somewhere to, helps it bind. The other is get better closing, right? So we'd like to have some moisture there, but we also want to balance that with, we don't want it so wet that, we're causing compaction issues or smearing off alongside, if we're using a shank type deal, smearing off alongside when we're running. So, we want some moisture, but we don't want it too wet. And it really doesn't take that much moisture to really minimize our loss. So but we gotta have some.
And the gurus, case tag, weather department, you get some of the stuff.
No, I don't, even our climatologist, we had him out last week. I didn't get to hear his talk, but I don't think he made very many bold predictions.
the guy up in the Kansas Association of Independent Crop Consultants said it was gonna be a warm, dry winter. A very active spring. Which kind of sounded stormy for most of us. And then another hot, dry summer.
Yeah.
It wasn't encouraging.
The one guy I read a bit, his projection was that he didn't really see significant pattern change till August, September. Now, I've not checked back in the last month or two to see if that story has changed, but.
Yeah, because last week the climatologist talked, Matt Siddle.
Yeah.
He's our new climatologist at K-State.
Oh,
That's
good.
for your acres. Yeah, they're retired. We are now in a La Nina, which is causing the warm, drier conditions. I think there is a possibility that we could be in an El Nina, which brings more moisture. Yes, El Nino,
El Nino, La Nina.
La Nina. Okay, so there's two different things, and I think you mentioned there's a possibility after August. I don't know what the-
But, back to your comment on weather though, it's still. Yeah, I'm not sure how much weight we put in these 60, 90-day forecasts, but certainly if we catch some moisture, and if we're applying our in closer to planting time, if we've got a full profile, I'm gonna be more optimistic in my yield goal than if not, right? The other important thing from moisture standpoint is looking at that 10-day, 2-week outlook, because that's where we can make some decisions about using the NDPT, the agrotane type products, right? Because those things provide us basically 14 days of protection. It's volatilization before we get some meaningful precip. And so it's one of those days we can, you're kind of gambling, but if I'm looking out in that 14-day forecast and I've got multiple good chances of moisture, that might sway me a different direction than if I'm looking at the forecast and it is going to be warm and dry, as far as the eye can see, my likelihood of getting a payback from an agrotane type product is a lot higher.
I know I run into trouble with spreading the weeds. It stays dry for about 3 weeks and the spring's gone.
Well, that's everything. It takes some moisture to activate these residual herbicides. We had a lot of people that didn't put on residuals this fall because of how dry it was, but now we have gotten enough moisture that I kind of wonder if maybe we wouldn't have wished we would have put something out.
The guys that got their urea under the snow. There were some people throwing the idea around selling different strains of bacillus to quote unquote unlock the phosphorus in the soil. And I just looked at it. You're gonna have to explain that to me. How does a microbe like that replace your need to apply it?
Well,
It'll use what's already in the soil.
There's a lot of these things. It's kind of like at one point in time, there was a lot of discussion about buckwheat. Had the ability to unlock P, and so, there's a lot of these things that I think at a technical level or a theoretical level, you could connect the dots and say this should happen. But it comes back to at what quantity. And what's the quantity that it's releasing that way versus the entire uptake needs.
That's what's
Right.
got to be, they were talking about doing it as a broadcast spray at very low level.
Jim Camerato at Purdue had a presentation, they did some of that stuff. What stuck with me was he said that if you have a gram of soil, which is about the weight of a penny, you have 50 billion microbes in there. And with the additives, they figured some of the knockouts, they're putting on 20 to 25. That's in that soil, so it needs to get the number.
And keeping the bugs alive, and I think even when I think about like the Pivot Bio product, and so I saw a real interesting presentation from their agronomist last week, and they're pretty upfront about this, even as they're screening for potential biologicals, finding stuff that will survive is the first step. You got to find something that will actually live long enough in the soil to do anything. And I think, that's a challenge.
Well, if you're broadcast spraying, you're putting on the foliage and you're putting it on the surface, you're not, somehow it's gotta get to.
And you're exposing it, you're just laying it out there. And so you think about that versus putting a biological on in furrow. I certainly like the odds of that better,
Just block a sheet.
But I do, so I do think it's interesting, this whole deal, and this goes into the discussion on the Bray too and everything too. I mean, there's no doubt you can use a stronger acid and show that it's no secret, there's a lot of mineral P in the soil.
Yeah.
And you can just keep making your acid stronger and you can keep showing there's more and more P there. That doesn't necessarily mean it's easily available. And and Fred showed some of the stuff out of Tribune. I think it's interesting. So in that study, there are some plots in there. We have full controls. There are plots that have received 0 N and 0 P since 1960. And we've been raising continuous irrigated corn and sorghum. What do you think those plots yield? You put on 0 fertilizer in 60 some years, what type of crop do you think can still be raised?
They did pretty well, as I remember.
I heard a number. 50, 60, so you're about 60 to 70 is what those control plots raise. And I think that's interesting, back to this discussion of P. The grain that comes off those plots is a little bit lower grain P concentration than what our standards are, like on corn, instead of 0.33, I think it's like 0.29 or so. It's a little bit lower, but still, even at that, at 70 bushel, and at those concentrations, we're still removing 20 to 30 pounds of P a year from those plots. It's coming from somewhere. So we haven't put any on in 60 years. And so I think it gives us some insight into that low level mineralization of P out of the mineral form into the plant available form. I think it gives us some insight into that. That's pretty interesting, that under those conditions, if you completely remove all other phos, that soil is supplying somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 pounds a year. And that's on stuff that a soil test P Malick or, on it would be like 5. And we bottomed out the soil test values within the first 10 years of the study.
That's pretty low.
Yeah, but that's kind of a basement number. You won't see the numbers come back much lower than 5 or 6. That's just kind of that's just kind of a basement number.
I think I've seen -2 from Turkey.
I don't think so. But anyways, but back to that mineralized. I mean, I think I find that fascinating.
Less